Mr. Hornsby, she said, her voice like chilled sherry, this is not just a good case. This is a delightful one. Your ownership of Miller's Pond, now erroneously referred to as Lake Serenity, is ironclad. The Homeowners Association has absolutely no jurisdiction over your boat, its color, its level of whimsy, or the dietary habits of the birds it attracts, as long as it is on your lake. And the Lake Serenity Fishing Club? Her smile widened, revealing a hint of metaphorical fang. They are, to put it charitably, long-term, exceptionally fortunate, and entirely unlicensed squatters on your private property. Music to my ears. So, Miss DeMarco, I said, leaning forward, if I were so inclined as to, say, suggest to the fishing club that they might find their angling pursuits more congenial in a different body of water? You could, Mr. Hornsby, she confirmed, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the deed. Serve them with a legally binding notice to vacate your property. You would need to give them a reasonable time frame to remove their accoutrements. If they failed to comply after that period, they would be trespassing. And trespassing, as you know, can have rather inconvenient consequences. Her eyes gleamed. This, she purred, will be fun. The sun was doing that lovely early morning thing where it makes everything look soft and gold-dusted, even the slightly peeling paint on my old pontoon boat, the Ponderosa. I was out on my dock, happily tinkering with the solar panel that powered my pride and joy, a vintage margarita blender I'd lovingly restored. It was purely for medicinal purposes, you understand. Sun-dappled lake, gentle breeze, a perfectly chilled, virgin, it was only 9 a.m. after all, lime concoction. That's my kind of therapy. The therapy session was rudely interrupted by the click-clack of determinedly sensible heels on my wooden pier. I didn't even need to look up. That sound, like a metronome set to irritatingly efficient, could only belong to one person, Harriet Quill, our newly elected and already widely dreaded HOA president. She was also, by no coincidence whatsoever, the self-appointed head of the brand-new Lake Serenity Aesthetic and Vessel Standardization Committee. Mr. Hornsby! Her voice was as sharp and unyielding as her severe gray pantsuit. She was holding a clipboard like a weapon and a digital camera, like she was documenting a crime scene, which, in her mind, she probably was. We need to have a serious discussion regarding the current state of your watercraft. I sighed, wiping a smudge of non-existent dust from the blender's chrome. Morning to you too, Harriet. Lovely day for a bit of harmonious flotation, wouldn't you say? I gestured vaguely at the shimmering expanse of Lake Serenity. Care for a test margarita? Freshly squeezed lime? Good for the aesthetic. Harriet's nostrils flared, a sure sign she was not amused. This is hardly a laughing matter, Mr. Hornsby. Several significant violations of the new Harmonious Flotation Initiative, as ratified by the board last Tuesday, have been noted on this vessel. She said vessel with the same distaste one might use for unidentified pond scum. Violations? I asked, genuinely puzzled. On the Ponderosa? She's been floating harmoniously right here, bothering no one for the past 15 years. What seems to be the issue this time? Is the margarita blender not up to the new beverage preparation equipment harmonization code? Among other, more egregious infractions, Harriet sniffed, consulting her clipboard of doom. Item 1, unapproved avian attractants. She pointed an accusing finger at the charming little custom-built bird feeder I had attached to the railing, which a family of wrens was currently enjoying. Said avians are depositing organic particulate matter at an unacceptable rate. Item 2, non-regulation reflective surfaces. That solar panel, she gestured at my eco-friendly power source, is reportedly causing significant glare, blinding Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle during her morning lakeside Tai Chi routine. Item 3, excessive. And I quote from the committee findings, unstructured whimsy. Her gaze swept disdainfully over the string of cheerful, solar-powered fairy lights I'd artfully draped around the pontoon's canopy. And item 4, Mr. Hornsby, the vessel's primary color, which our certified Pantone expert has identified as faded deck chair beige, is categorically not on the approved palette of tranquil teal, peaceful putty, or the ever-popular serene slate. I was gobsmacked. My jaw literally dropped. Whimsy? I sputtered. You're citing me for whimsy, Harriet? My boat isn't beige. It's vintage desert ivory with sun-kissed highlights, and the birds are my friends. Harriet remained unmoved, her expression set in concrete. She raised her camera and snapped a photo of the offending margarita blender, the flash making me blink. You have precisely 48 hours to rectify these egregious breaches of community standards, Mr. Hornsby. Failure to comply will result in daily conformity levies, commencing at $50 and escalating with non-compliance. Furthermore, she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial yet threatening tone, the Lake Serenity Fishing Club has formally expressed concerns about your unconventional vessel, potentially disturbing the delicate spawning beds during their upcoming annual charity base tournament. She thrust a printed list of violations into my hand, turned on her sensible heel, and click-clacked back towards shore, leaving me in a state of stunned disbelief. I looked at my beloved, whimsical Ponderosa, then at the list. They want to standardize the Ponderosa into a floating beige box? I muttered to a curious mallard that had paddled up to investigate the commotion. They'll have to pry the fairy lights and the margarita blender from my cold, whimsical, and increasingly annoyed hands. Later that afternoon, nursing a decidedly non-virgin margarita, it felt like a medicinal necessity now, I sat in my living room, overlooking the lake, and fumed. The official Notice of Aesthetic Non-Compliance lay on the coffee table, mocking me with its bureaucratic jargon. Harriet Quill. She'd been HOA president for all of 3 months, a recent retiree from some high-powered corporate law firm, where she'd presumably specialized in hostile takeovers and soul-crushing litigation. Now she was applying those same skills to the previously peaceful enclave of Lake Serenity Estates. Her declared mission: to elevate our community to premier status, which, as far as I could tell, meant sucking every last ounce of individuality and joy out of it and replacing it with a monotonous landscape of approved neutrals and strictly regulated fun. Lake Serenity, she'd declared at her inaugural HOA speech, her voice ringing with the conviction of a zealot, will henceforth become the undisputed model of refined lakeside living. We will have standards. We will have uniformity. We will have rigorously enforced covenants and escalating fines for any deviation from the established aesthetic. It sounded less like a neighborhood improvement plan and more like a manifesto for a very dull cult. And the Lake Serenity Fishing Club, they were a whole other kettle of, well, fish. They'd been a fixture around here for over 50 years, long before most of the current houses were even built. They had a rickety old clubhouse, perched on what everyone just assumed was community land at the far end of the lake. They operated with a deep-seated sense of entitlement, feeling they owned the lake, despite mostly just being there, casting lines, and occasionally leaving behind tangled fishing wire and empty bait containers. Their current president, a crusty old fellow named Stan Salty Hogwood, was one of Harriet Quill's staunchest allies, largely because Harriet, in her quest for community engagement, had promised the club new HOA-funded dock improvements, provided they adhered to the new color palette, of course. I'd had minor run-ins with the fishing club before. Their members weren't always the most considerate. Stray lures snagged on my dock lines, the roar of their base boats during pre-dawn tournament starts, the occasional beer can found floating near my shore. But Harriet's crusade against the Ponderosa, apparently with the fishing club's backing, was a new level of coordinated overreach. Disturbing the sacred spawning beds with a solar-powered margarita blender? I scoffed to myself, pouring another medicinal dose. The fish probably think it's a delightful underwater disco party and are lining up to spawn closer to the source of potential tiny umbrellas. The spawning beds comment, though, niggled at me. It implied a certain territoriality, a claim over the lake's resources that, combined with Harriet's officiousness, just rubbed me the wrong way. Annoyed, and with a retired science teacher's ingrained respect for facts and data, I decided to do a little research. Exactly where did my property lines lie in relation to this suddenly sacrosanct lake? I vaguely remembered my grandfather, who'd bought this plot of land back when it was just fields and a rather large pond, being an absolute stickler for precise boundaries and documented rights. He'd always said, "Good fences make good neighbors, Gus, but good deeds make for undisputed fishing spots." Up in the dusty, cobweb-draped attic, amidst boxes of old teaching materials and my grandmother's formidable collection of porcelain thimbles, I found it. A long cardboard tube labeled Hornsby Property, Original Surveys and Deeds. Inside, rolled tight and smelling faintly of time and forgotten legal battles, was the original deed from 1958, along with a meticulously hand-drawn plot map, the ink faded but still legible. I unrolled it carefully on the living room floor. My heart gave a little thump. I traced the familiar lines of my lot, the house, the shoreline where my dock extended. And then I saw it. The property lines, clearly marked with bearings and distances, didn't stop at the water's edge as I'd always casually assumed. They extended into the lake. Far into it. In fact, they appeared to encompass the entire lake bed, and, according to a spidery handwritten addendum, all appurtenant water and riparian rights associated with what was then called Miller's Pond. No, I breathed, a strange tingling sensation starting in my fingertips. It can't be. They named it Lake Serenity when they built the development in the 70s, but... My next stop was the Polk County Records Office. A soulless beige building filled with the hushed rustle of ancient paper and the low hum of flickering fluorescent lights. My heart was doing a tap dance against my ribs. A helpful, if monumentally bored, clerk with a name tag that read Doris, "Ask me anything," within reason, eventually located the official microfiche records for Lot 42, Miller's Pond Tract. She squinted at the glowing screen, chewing her gum with rhythmic precision. "Well, now ain't that something?" Doris drawled, after a few minutes of scrolling and zooming. "Looks like your Lot 42, Mr. Hornsby, includes the entirety of what they now call Lake Serenity. Original plat map from '58, clear as day. And here," she tapped the screen, "is a notation regarding exclusive fishing, boating, and general aquatic enjoyment rights granted to the owner of said Lot 42. The surrounding lots? They just got scenic easement and lake view privileges. Fancy way of saying they can look, but they can't touch without your say-so." I stared at the illuminated document, my mind reeling. I owned the lake. The entire lake, the spawning beds, the water column, the muddy bottom, the whole kit and caboodle. Doris popped her gum. "Yep, looks like you own the whole puddle, mister. Congratulations. Wanna buy on my grandpappy owned your whole dang lake and all I got was this lousy t-shirt? Kidding. We don't have those. Yet. A slow, dangerous, and utterly delightful grin started to spread across my face. It was the kind of grin a hibernating bear might wear upon discovering the squatters who'd been using his cave for winter storage were also the ones who'd been complaining about his snoring. "Harriet Quill," I whispered to myself, the grin widening. "You and your harmonious flotation initiative, not to mention your entitled fishing club, have just poked a very interesting, and now very well-informed, bear. The first call I made was to Miss Eleanor DeMarco of DeMarco, Finch and Associates, a law firm whose reputation for steely competence and taking no prisoners was legendary in 3 counties. I figured if I was going to drop a bombshell on the HOA, I wanted the best legal artillery on my side. Miss DeMarco, a woman whose tailored suits looked like they could deflect small arms fire and whose smile could freeze boiling water, listened to my story with an expression of increasingly rapt attention. When I presented her with copies of the deed, the original plat map, and Doris's confirmation from the county records, that sharp smile of hers appeared. It was a thing of terrifying beauty. "Mr. Hornsby," she said, her voice like chilled sherry, "this is not just a good case. This is a delightful one. Your ownership of Miller's Pond, now erroneously referred to as Lake Serenity, is ironclad. The Homeowners Association has absolutely no jurisdiction over your boat, its color, its level of whimsy, or the dietary habits of the birds it attracts, as long as it is on your lake. And the Lake Serenity Fishing Club." Her smile widened, revealing a hint of metaphorical fang. "They are, to put it charitably, long-term, exceptionally fortunate, and entirely unlicensed squatters on your private property." Music to my ears. "So, Miss DeMarco," I said, leaning forward, "if I were so inclined as to, say, suggest to the fishing club that they might find their angling pursuits more congenial in a different body of water?" "You could, Mr. Hornsby," she confirmed, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the deed. "Serve them with a legally binding notice to vacate your property. You would need to give them a reasonable time frame to remove their accoutrements. If they fail to comply after that period, they would be trespassing. And trespassing, as you know, can have rather inconvenient consequences." Her eyes gleamed. "This," she purred, "will be fun." My next call was to Straight Line Steve Potemkin of Potemkin Precision Surveying. Steve was a man who lived and breathed property boundaries. His motto was, "If it ain't staked, it ain't yours." "Steve, old friend," I said into the phone, "I have a rather interesting little job for you. It involves some very old lines, a rather large body of water, and a pressing need for some highly visible demarcation." "Sounds intriguing, Gus," Steve's gravelly voice crackled back. "You finally decided to fence in that patch of poison ivy Harriet Quill keeps complaining is encroaching on the community walking trail?" "Even better, Steve," I said, a chuckle escaping me. "Much, much better. And when you plant those survey stakes, make them big and obnoxiously orange. I want them visible from the International Space Station. Or, at the very least," I added, "from Harriet Quill's back porch, where she sips her doubtlessly regulation temperature herbal tea." Finally, I dialed Signs Are Us, a local outfit run by a fellow named Barry who had a flair for the dramatic. "Barry, it's Gus Hornsby. I need some signs. Several, in fact. Tasteful, you understand, but firm. Very, very firm. They should convey a certain unambiguous message of private ownership and the cessation of previously tolerated recreational activities." I then dictated the wording I had carefully crafted, a masterpiece of polite but unyielding legalese, with a little Hornsby flourish at the end. "And Barry," I finished, "can you make the font on private property extra large, perhaps in a color that suggests impending doom for trespassers?" Barry assured me he had just the shade. A few days later, Straight-Line Steve and his crew descended upon Lake Serenity, or, as I was now privately calling it, Lake Hornsby. Armed with GPS transits, sledgehammers, and a seemingly endless supply of very large, very orange wooden stakes, they went to work. The rhythmic thud of the stake driver became the new soundtrack of the neighborhood. They planted those stakes with an almost gleeful precision, right across the meticulously manicured community beach, which, it turned out, was entirely on my land. Straight through the middle of the Lake Serenity Fishing Club's prize-winning rose bushes, planted, as Steve delightedly informed me, a good 10 feet inside my actual property line. And most satisfyingly, they effectively cordoned off the fishing club's dilapidated, peeling paint clubhouse, making it look like a sad, isolated little shack on an island of Gus Hornsby's rightful domain. The members of the fishing club, who were gathering for their weekly pre-tournament strategy meeting and fish story exaggeration session, watched Steve's activities with expressions that shifted from mild curiosity to baffled silence, and then to rapidly dawning, sputtering agitation. Salty Hogwood, the club's president, a man whose weathered face looked like a relief map of every fishing trip he'd ever taken, stumped over to Steve, his fishing vest bristling with indignation. "Hey, what in the blue blazes do you think you're doing to my award-winning Peace Roses, pal?" he bellowed, his voice raspy from years of shouting over outboard motors. "This here is Lake Serenity Fishing Club land. Been that way for nigh on 50 years. Steve, a man utterly unfazed by bluster, calmly consulted the glowing screen of his high-tech GPS thingamajig. "Well, sir," he said in his slow, deliberate drawl, "according to this here satellite-verified, laser-guided Polk County official record survey, this here particular patch of dirt, including the dirt currently occupied by your rather charming, if aggressively thorny, rose bushes, belongs to Mr. Gus Hornsby of Lot 42, and his petunias, should he ever choose to plant 'em in this exact spot." Just then, alerted by a flurry of frantic phone calls from her fishing club allies, Harriet Quill arrived on the scene. She took one look at the sea of orange stakes, her face turning a shade of puce that clashed spectacularly with her peaceful putty-colored blazer. Her perfectly coiffed hair seemed to vibrate with suppressed fury. The game, as they say, was afoot. And I, from the comfortable vantage point of my porch, armed with a fresh, defiant margarita, was very much enjoying the kickoff. The day after Straight-Line, Steve completed his highly visible demarcation of my aquatic kingdom. Barry from Signs R Us arrived. The signs were magnificent. Large, professionally printed, on heavy-duty aluminum, with lettering that was both elegant and unmistakably authoritative. We planted them at every conceivable access point to what was now, in no uncertain terms, Lake Hornsby. Private property. Lake Hornsby, formerly Miller's Pond, one proclaimed in bold, no-nonsense letters. Registered to Gus Hornsby, Lot 42, all rights reserved. Another, strategically placed near the now isolated fishing club clubhouse, read, "No unauthorized fishing, boating, swimming, Oregon aesthetic standardization activities permitted. The Lake Serenity, fishing clubs previously tolerated, though legally unsanctioned, occupancy of these premises is hereby formally terminated. Please remove yourselves, your structure, and your collection of rusty lures and questionable fishing tails within 30 calendar days from the date posted below. Failure to comply will result in further legal action. P.S. The margarita blender stays. And the fairy lights. Have a nice day." Miss DeMarco, my formidable lawyer, had drafted an equally formidable eviction notice. It was a masterpiece of legal prose, polite yet utterly unyielding, outlining my undisputed ownership and formally giving the Lake Serenity Fishing Club 30 days to vacate my property, remove their clubhouse and all associated paraphernalia, and cease all future activities on or around Lake Hornsby. This notice was sent via certified mail to Salty Hogwood as club president and to Harriet Quill as HOA president, just to ensure she felt included in the joyous tidings. For good measure, I also had Miss DeMarco's stern-faced paralegal tack a laminated copy directly to the weathered front door of the fishing club clubhouse. From my porch, comfortably ensconced in my favorite deck chair, the Ponderosa bobbing gently at my dock beside me, I had a perfect view of Harriet Quill discovering the notice. Her reaction was, as Miss DeMarco might have put it, delightful. It progressed through several distinct stages: initial confusion, head tilt, dawning comprehension, eyes widening, sputtering disbelief, hands gesticulating wildly, and finally, incandescent rage, face achieving a shade of crimson that would have made a prize-winning tomato jealous. She ripped the notice from the door, crumpled it into a furious ball, and stomped on it for good measure. Then she glared across the water directly at me. I raised my margarita glass in a silent, cheerful toast. The Lake Serenity Fishing Club, predictably, did not take this news lying down. Egged on by a still fuming Salty Hogwood and a strategically manipulative Harriet Quill, who was now framing this as an attack on community heritage and the very fabric of lakeside living. They decided I was bluffing. Their annual, much-hyped Serenity Base Masters Open Invitational Tournament was scheduled for the upcoming weekend. They'd sold tickets, they'd ordered commemorative beer koozies. They were not about to let a few no trespassing signs and some uppity science teacher ruin their biggest event of the year. Tournament morning arrived, crisp and clear. And sure enough, by 7 a.m., my Lake Hornsby was teeming with a flotilla of base boats, their occupants blissfully, or perhaps defiantly, ignoring the very large, very orange stakes and the even larger, even more explicit signs. Salty Hogwood himself, in his souped-up glitter rocket of a fishing boat, was defiantly casting his line not 20 feet from my dock, practically daring me to do something. I sighed. I really hadn't wanted it to come to this. But some people, it seemed, only understood the language of official intervention. From my dock, armed with a small, battery-powered megaphone I'd bought for just such an eventuality, and for calling Buster when he wandered too far into the woods, I addressed the assembled anglers. "Good morning, gentlemen, ladies!" I boomed, my voice echoing across the unnaturally still water. The fish, it seemed, were also boycotting the unauthorized tournament. "Lovely day for fishing, isn't it? Unfortunately, you are all currently trespassing on private property. This is Lake Hornsby, and I, Gus Hornsby, am its sole proprietor. I'll have to kindly ask you to vacate the premises immediately." A wave of muttering and disgruntled glares swept through the assembled boats. Salty Hogwood lowered his rod and glowered at me. "Now you listen here, Hornsby," he yelled, his voice gravelly. "This here is Lake Serenity, and it's been the home of the Bass Masters for 30 years. We ain't going nowhere. Harriet Quill says you're a certifiable lunatic, and your paperwork ain't worth the fancy paper it's printed on." I sighed again, this time with more theatrical weariness. I pulled out my cell phone and calmly dialed 911. "Yes, good morning," I said, my voice loud enough for most of the nearby boats to hear. "I'd like to report approximately 20 trespassing vessels and a rather belligerent group of anglers currently staging an unauthorized fishing tournament on my private lake, Lake Hornsby, at 12 Serenity Lane. Yes, Hornsby, Hornsby. Yes, I have all the documentation right there. Thank you. I'll wait for the officers." The effect was almost instantaneous. The defiant bravado among the anglers seemed to deflate like a leaky inflatable raft. The words private lake and trespassing and officers have a way of doing that. Within 15 minutes, 2 Polk County Sheriff's Department cruisers pulled up to my driveway. Out stepped a young, professional-looking Officer Ramirez and a slightly older, more seasoned Officer O'Malley, who had the patient, seen-it-all expression of a man who had dealt with more than his fair share of neighborhood squabbles. I met them at the edge of my property, armed with my folder of meticulously organized documents. The deed, the survey maps, copies of the eviction notice, and even photographs of the newly installed signs. "Good morning, officers," I said calmly. "Thank you for responding so promptly. As I mentioned on the phone, this is my private lake, Lake Hornsby. These gentlemen," I gestured towards the now rather sheepish-looking flotilla, "are members of the Lake Serenity Fishing Club. They were formally served with a notice to vacate these premises some weeks ago, as their presence here constitutes trespassing. They seem to be experiencing some reluctance in complying." Just then, Harriet Quill, having been alerted by a frantic call from Salty, came power-walking down the lane, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "Officers, this is an outrage," she declared, bypassing me entirely. "This man," she pointed an accusing finger at me, "is attempting to steal a beloved community asset. Lake Serenity has been open to the public and the fishing club for generations. He can't just kick people out. It's un-American. It's against the spirit of lakeside camaraderie." Officer Ramirez, a model of professional decorum, accepted my folder of documents. He and Officer O'Malley reviewed them carefully, occasionally exchanging quiet words. Salty Hogwood motored his boat closer to the shore, still grumbling but looking considerably less confident. The other anglers watched in tense silence. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, Officer Ramirez looked up. He addressed Salty Hogwood first. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we've reviewed Mr. Hornsby's documentation. It appears to be in order. According to these official county records, the body of water known as Lake Hornsby, formerly Miller's Pond, is indeed private property belonging to Mr. Hornsby. He has also provided a legally served notice to vacate, which appears to have expired." He then turned to Harriet Quill, who looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. "Ma'am," he said, "while I understand your concerns about community access, the legal ownership of this lake is quite clear. As such, the individuals currently on the lake without Mr. Hornsby's permission are, in fact, trespassing." A collective groan went up from the base boats. Salty Hogwood's face crumpled. Harriet looked like she might actually explode. "Therefore," Officer O'Malley concluded, his voice leaving no room for argument, "we are going to have to ask all unauthorized vessels and personnel to please vacate Lake Hornsby immediately and without further incident. Failure to do so could result in citations for trespassing." The fight visibly drained out of the fishing club. Grumbling, cursing under their breath, and shooting murderous glares in my direction, they began, one by one, to reel in their lines, start their engines, and head for the now very distant public boat ramp on the far side of what they still probably thought of as their lake. The Serenity Bass Masters Open Invitational Tournament was officially, and rather ignominiously, a bust. Harriet Quill stood on the shore, speechless for once, her face a mixture of fury and utter disbelief. I allowed myself a small, private smile. Round 2 to Hornsby. The HOA emergency meeting that evening was, by all accounts, gleaned from my high-tech birdwatching directional microphone, which I just happened to be testing on my porch in the general direction of the community hall. An absolute masterclass in bureaucratic meltdown. Harriet Quill, her voice hoarse with indignation, apparently railed against predatory property owners, the tyranny of ancient deeds, and the tragic erosion of communal fishing rights. "There must be a way," she'd shrieked, according to my highly sensitive audio equipment. "We can't let him privatize our heritage. Our annual fishing tournaments are legendary. They bring in dozens of dollars in registration fees and considerable prestige." Salty Hogwood, sounding thoroughly deflated, apparently kept muttering about uppity science teachers and the good old days when a man could fish where he pleased without some fancy lawyer waving papers at him. Various members suggested increasingly desperate and legally dubious countermeasures. Could they claim adverse possession of the lake? Miss DeMarco had already thoroughly briefed me on why this was a non-starter. Their previous use was never hostile or exclusive, merely tolerated by previous, unaware owners like myself. Could they petition the county to condemn the lake for public recreational good and seize it via eminent domain? The legal costs and complexities of such a maneuver, Miss DeMarco had assured me, would be astronomical and likely tie the HOA up in court for years, a prospect that even Harriet seemed to blanch at when it was pointed out. Interestingly, a few dissenting voices piped up during the chaos. Old Mrs. Henderson, the one who'd been fined for her exuberant petunias in a previous HOA anecdote, apparently pointed out that Mr. Hornsby always was a quiet, reasonable man until that newfangled boat committee started pestering him about his perfectly charming fairy lights. Another resident, Dave, from down the street, reportedly grumbled that maybe if the fishing club hadn't made so much darn noise at 5 a.m. every tournament morning, folks might be a bit more sympathetic to their plight. And that clubhouse is a bit of an eyesore, if we're being honest. The meeting, it seemed, ended in a stalemate of fury, frustration, and a dawning, uncomfortable realization among some members that perhaps, just perhaps, Harriet Quill had overplayed her hand. The 30-day eviction period was rapidly approaching its end. The dilapidated fishing club clubhouse, however, still stood defiantly on my property, a monument to their stubborn denial. It was time for the next phase of Operation Lake Liberation. I made a call to Demo Dave Jankowski, a local contractor whose business card simply read, "Demo Dave, we make things go away. No questions asked, within reason." "Dave, it's Gus Hornsby," I said when he answered, his voice a cheerful baritone that sounded like it could level a small building on its own. "I have a small, somewhat historically significant but ultimately unwanted structure on my private property that needs to, shall we say, cease to exist in its current form. And once it has ceased to exist, I was thinking of installing a new, very private, very comfortable dock, perhaps with a tasteful gazebo at the end, and maybe a very prominent, hand-carved wooden sign proclaiming it as the official headquarters of the Lake Hornsby Philosophical and Margarita Appreciation Society. Founding member and current president, me." Demo Dave chuckled, a sound that made my phone vibrate. "Deconstruction of the old and exclusive reconstruction of the new, eh, Mr. Hornsby? That's my absolute specialty, especially if it happens to be mildly inconveniencing an overzealous homeowners association. I've developed quite a soft spot for that particular kind of community service work over the years." We discussed the plans. Dave, a man who clearly appreciated the finer points of strategic demolition and aesthetically pleasing lakeside lounging, was full of good ideas. He also suggested some much-needed shoreline restoration work once the old clubhouse footprint was cleared. "We can put in some native aquatic plants, create some proper fish habitat," he'd said with a wink. "Improve the actual spawning beds if you catch my drift. Show 'em how a real lake steward operates." I liked Dave. Dave understood. Deadline day dawned bright and clear. At precisely 8 a.m., Demo Dave's gleaming yellow bulldozer rumbled to a halt just outside my newly staked property line, its massive blade glinting in the morning sun. It was a beautiful, intimidating sight. Miss DeMarco, looking exceptionally sharp in a power suit that could probably stop traffic, was present, clipboard in hand, an expression of serene legal authority on her face. For good measure, and at Miss DeMarco's sage suggestion, 2 Polk County Sheriff's deputies, the very same officers Ramirez and O'Malley from the tournament debacle, were also on hand, ostensibly to keep the peace and ensure a smooth transition of property. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but I thought I detected a faint glimmer of amusement in Officer O'Malley's eyes. Salty Hogwood and a handful of his most die-hard fishing club cronies were making a forlorn last stand. They looked like a band of defeated pirates, glumly removing their ancient, dust-covered trophies, their faded photographs of long-dead fish, and their collection of equally long-dead fishing magazines from the condemned clubhouse. The fight had clearly gone out of them. The sight of the bulldozer, coupled with Miss DeMarco's steely gaze and the uniformed presence of the law, had a wonderfully clarifying effect on their understanding of property rights. Harriet Quill was there, of course. She was practically vibrating with impotent rage, still trying to argue obscure points of riparian law with Miss DeMarco, who simply, and repeatedly, handed her a copy of the now court-affirmed order confirming my ownership and the legality of the eviction. Each time, Harriet would snatch the paper, glare at it as if it personally offended her, and then resume her sputtering. By sunset, it was over. The clubhouse stood empty, its windows dark and forlorn, looking even sadder and more dilapidated than before. Salty and his crew had retreated, taking their rusty lures and their wounded pride with them. The next morning, Demo Dave and his crew made short, impressively efficient work of the old fishing club clubhouse. There were no dramatic explosions, much to my slight disappointment. Dave said something about unnecessary paperwork and startling the migratory waterfowl. Just the methodical, powerful crunch of the bulldozer and the whine of power saws. By lunchtime, the clubhouse was reduced to a neat pile of recyclable lumber and a slightly larger pile of landfill-bound debris. It was gone, vanished, as if it had never been. Over the next week, Dave's crew worked on my new dock and gazebo. It was a thing of beauty, sturdy, elegant, with built-in benches and, yes, a dedicated, waterproof outlet for the margarita blender. As part of his shoreline restoration initiative, Dave also directed his crew to remove an astonishing amount of old junk and debris that had accumulated around the footprint of the old clubhouse over the decades. More tires, broken bottles, tangled masses of fishing line, even a rusted-out lawnmower. The transformation was remarkable. The shoreline looked cleaner, healthier. The water itself seemed to sparkle a little brighter. Some of the neighbors, even a few of the former fishing club diehards, started to wander by, watching the progress with a mixture of curiosity and, I thought, grudging admiration. The new dock was undeniably a significant improvement over the rotting, precarious timbers of the old fishing club pier, and the cleaner shoreline. Well, even Harriet Quill couldn't argue with that. Speaking of Harriet, a few days after my magnificent new dock and gazebo were completed, complete with the Lake Hornsby Philosophical and Margarita Appreciation Society Members Only sign, she appeared at the end of my pier. She looked different, subdued. Her usual power suit was replaced by surprisingly casual slacks and a blouse. Her hair was slightly less architectural. "Mr. Hornsby," she began, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Gus, your improvements, they are quite something." She gestured vaguely at the newly restored shoreline, the elegant sweep of my new dock. "The lake does look significantly better. Cleaner, I took a slow sip of my celebratory margarita. The blender was working perfectly in its new, dedicated gazebo outlet. "Funny what happens when you actually take care of your own private property, isn't it, Harriet?" I said, my voice mild. No harmonious flotation initiative or vessel standardization committee needed, just a bit of common sense and some good old-fashioned elbow grease, and a bulldozer. Can't forget the bulldozer. Harriet actually winced. The former members of the Lake Serenity Fishing Club," she said, swallowing what I could only assume was a sizable chunk of her pride, "are quite distraught. They've fished on this lake, well, on Miller's Pond, their entire lives, many of them, their fathers and grandfathers before them. It was a tradition. A tradition of trespassing on private property, as it turns out," I pointed out, gently but firmly. "Yes, well, be that as it may," she conceded, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. "They are at a loss. Is there any possibility of some kind of managed access agreement? Strictly for fishing, of course. No unapproved avian attractants. No excessively whimsical boats. We would naturally be prepared to pay a reasonable annual access fee." I looked out over my Lake Hornsby, shimmering in the afternoon sun. The Ponderosa bobbed gently, its fairy lights, which I'd defiantly restrung, brighter than ever, twinkling in anticipation of dusk. "A fee," she said. "And what about the Vessel Standardization Committee? Would my margarita blender finally be safe from regulatory persecution?" The thought was tempting. The negotiations for what came to be known as the Lake Hornsby Accords took place in my new gazebo over several pitchers of surprisingly good iced tea provided by a humbled Harriet Quill. Salty Hogwood was also present, looking like a man who'd lost a wrestling match with a very large catfish, but also, strangely, a bit relieved. After much internal debate, I wasn't aiming to be a total curmudgeon, and the lake was, admittedly, large enough to share a little, under the right circumstances. I agreed to allow limited, strictly controlled fishing access, but it would be on my terms. Together with Miss DeMarco's expert guidance, she seemed to be thoroughly enjoying her role as architect of HOA reform. We drafted a charter for the newly formed Lake Hornsby Angling Association. The rules were clear, concise, and, I thought, eminently reasonable. Strict catch-and-release policy for all largemouth bass. Mandatory use of barbless hooks. No live bait to protect the water quality. Litter removal was not just encouraged, it was a condition of membership. Pack it in, pack it out, or pack your bags. No fishing within a 50-foot radius of my dock, especially during designated margarita and philosophical contemplation hours, which I reserved the right to declare at any time. And, most importantly, mandatory participation in an annual, GUS-supervised Lake Hornsby Cleanup and Ecological Restoration Day. The Vessel Standardization Committee, I insisted, was to be permanently disbanded, at least concerning any watercraft operating on Lake Hornsby. All boats launched onto my lake would be subject to only one rule: don't be an idiot, and don't sink. Whimsy was now officially tolerated, if not actively encouraged. To my astonishment, Harriet Quill, after only a token amount of quibbling over the precise definition of philosophical contemplation hours, agreed to all terms. Salty Hogwood, bless his crusty old heart, actually looked almost grateful. "Just want to fish, Gus," he'd mumbled, fiddling with the brim of his faded fishing cap. "Don't even mind that catch-and-release stuff so much anymore. My ticker ain't what it used to be anyway. Less cleaning, too." The first annual Lake Hornsby Angling Association Invitational. I'd let them keep the invitational part, as a small concession to Salty's pride, took place a few weeks later. It was a much smaller, quieter, and frankly more pleasant affair than the boisterous Bass Masters tournaments of old. I, aboard the Ponderosa, which was now sporting not only its fairy lights and bird feeders, but also a discreet, solar-powered underwater camera for ichthyological research purposes, acted as the official lake warden, chief whimsy officer, and supreme margarita blender operator. My primary duty was to ensure the new rules were being followed, and to occasionally offer helpful, if unsolicited, advice on lure selection. I even instituted a new prize category, Most Harmoniously Released Fish, awarded to the angler who demonstrated the most gentle and respectful catch and release technique. The winner received a small, hand-carved wooden fish trophy and a coupon for a free, virgin during tournament hours, margarita from the Ponderosa. Harriet Quill was present, not as an enforcer, but as an observer. I even saw her crack a smile, a genuine, non-regulatory smile, once, briefly. It was when someone complimented her on her new, rather fetching, peaceful putty-colored fishing vest. Progress. Life on Lake Hornsby settled into a new, and dare I say, improved rhythm. I was no longer just Gus Hornsby, the quiet retired science teacher with the quirky boat. I was Gus Hornsby, proprietor and benevolent overlord of Lake Hornsby, defender of avian attractants, champion of unstructured whimsy, and the man who had single-handedly, with a little help from some dusty old deeds and a very good lawyer, reformed an entire homeowners association through strategic property right assertion and a well-timed, legally sound eviction. The Ponderosa, my beloved, once-maligned pontoon, bobbed gently at her new, magnificent dock, her fairy lights twinkling merrily in the twilight. The margarita blender was silent for now, resting after a productive afternoon of philosophical contemplation support. A few members of the new Lake Hornsby Angling Association were fishing quietly at the far end of the lake, their lines tracing graceful arcs in the fading light. It was peaceful. It was serene. It was, in its own slightly eccentric way, harmonious. "Well, old girl," I murmured, giving the smooth, sun-warmed railing of the Ponderosa an affectionate pat. "Looks like a little bit of thoroughly documented character and a firm grasp of one's property rights can go a remarkably long way in rewriting the rules and ensuring the continued, unmolested operation of essential onboard beverage preparation equipment." I smiled, a genuine, contented smile. Lake Hornsby had never looked more beautiful or felt more truly mine. Now about that new submersible, multicolored LED lighting system I'd been thinking of installing for enhanced nighttime whimsy. The possibilities were endless,